Bienvenidos a La Repregunta, el especial, el primer programa. Todos los sábados vamos a traer las ideas de los pensadores globales que están marcando el ritmo en la manera en que concebimos la realidad, una realidad profundamente cambiante en este contexto particular, además de pandemia. Cada sábado habrá filósofos, sociólogos, economistas, políticos, historiadores, psicólogos que nos ayudan a entender y a correr los límites de lo pensable. En este sábado, dos de ellos. Uno es el doctor en biología británico Matt Ridley, un personaje único que debate mano a mano con Bill Gates, por ejemplo, autor de numerosos libros. El que está a punto de salir es cómo funciona la innovación y cómo florece en libertad. La libertad es clave para Ridley, que piensa las sociedades en función de, por ejemplo, la libertad de comercio. En este debate entre Estado versus libertades individuales que se da en el contexto de la pandemia, es una cabeza interesantísima para conocer. Thank you so much, Matt Ridley, for being here with us in La Repregunta. Matt, you have done very serious allegations against the model that the Imperial College produced in order to forecast the outcomes of the pandemic coronavirus, not only in England, but also in the United States. Which are these allegations?
My co-author and I, David Davis, is a member of Parliament and I'm a member of the House of Lords. And we think it's important that serious questions are asked because we have relied upon this model for policy in the UK, but also it has been influential elsewhere in the world. We now know a little bit more about how the model was put together, the computer code behind the model, and it is, on the whole, not very high standard computer code, we have learned, and very vulnerable to assumptions that might be wrong. And this might be why it has been producing numbers that don't seem to match the epidemic, even in countries such as Sweden, where there has been much less in the way of a lockdown of society.
Mm-hmm. This model had forecasted for the United States 2 million dead people in case the United States didn't decide to impose lockdowns. And in the case of Great Britain, they spoke about 550,000 dead. And there is the main character in this story is the guy, the epidemiologist, Neil Ferguson, who was responsible of the forecasting. Who is he and which is his record?
Neil Ferguson is a professor of epidemiology at Imperial College, and he has been involved in the forecasting of diseases before. And in the case of the foot and mouth epidemic in 2001 in the UK, his forecasts were responsible for a policy of slaughtering more than 6 million cattle, and they were heavily criticized by a formal inquiry afterwards as being too crude and too simplistic in the way they forecast what might happen to cattle. He then went on to forecast diseases including the mad cow disease, BSE, and in the early 2000s, when there was no sign of a significant increase in human cases of this disease, he still forecast 136,000 dead. In fact, only 177 people died. Mm-hmm. And in the case of swine flu and bird flu, he also forecast very large numbers of dead, and this didn't happen. So he has a track record of forecasting more deaths than happens, and this isn't just because of actions that are taken. He will say that this is because his job is to point out possible worst-case scenarios, but often these are presented not as worst-case scenarios, but as realistic possibilities.
Matt, Neil Ferguson had to resign from the SAGE committee, which advised the government, the British government over there, because of much more ordinary things, because he broke the lockdown and went to see her lover. But the main issue here is that the model that he produced could have led to decide the wrong decisions?
I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the countries that have coped well with the epidemic in Europe are the ones that did a lot of testing and not so much locking down. So testing in Germany was very effective at keeping the virus from getting into the hospitals. And in Sweden, a voluntary lockdown was more effective than a compulsory lockdown. And the reason for this seems to be that the virus is very infectious in people who get a very bad dose of the disease, particularly the elderly in hospital. It is not very infectious among people who get a very mild version of the disease, if at all, and that is children. So there are very big differences in terms of the transmission of the virus between different segments of the population. And the model doesn't take this heterogeneity of the population into account in a sufficient way.
I would like to review the critics you posed against this model. On this model, you said in the article appearing in the Telegraph, the code is deeply riddled with bugs. What does it mean?
A bug in computer terminology is a mistake that has to be corrected somewhere else in the code. This is not my view. I was quoting the view of coding experts who said that this code is not clean of problems. Now, the problem is that if a bug leads to a different outcome, that can be magnified and produce a different result. One of the ways you counteract this in modeling is to annotate your model very carefully so that you know which part of the model is producing which effect. And this apparently had not been done very fully in the model.
We could traduce or translate in a more ordinary language bug as mistake or errors embedded in the model?
Yes, a bug is an error, is a place where the code is not doing what it is supposed to be doing.
Okay.
The terminology goes back to the origin of computers when they used vacuum tubes, when insects did sometimes fly into the computer and crash into one of the vacuum tubes.
Oh, nice history reference. The other thing you say is a fairly arbitrary Heath-Robinson machine. What does it mean?
A Heath-Robinson machine is a British remark referring to a cartoonist named Heath Robinson who built, who drew very, very complicated machines in which a person at one end of the room would drop something on the floor, which resulted in something moving, which resulted in something tipping up, which resulted in something else moving, until right at the other end of the room, some result was experienced. Very, very complicated devices. Some people now build these real things and show them on social media, not necessarily the ones that were drawn in the cartoons. So Heath-Robinson machine is a terminology to imply something that has been put together rather messily and very often will not work.
Great. The other remark you make is that huge blocks of code, bad practice in terms of the software, this program they built.
Yes, again, this is not my comment. This is the comment of a modeler on social media who said that he would regard it as bad practice to have large blocks of code in a computer program without breaking it up into subroutines, into smaller segments, so that you can isolate a problem if it does happen and correct it. This model is not sufficiently broken up into subroutines, I'm told by the experts who've looked at it.
Has it been possible to know how they were working and they were producing this software, this program, this model before applying it and before making these political decisions with a huge impact in population?
The model is the computer code in the model is up to 13 years old, and it has been gradually changed over the years. So it was originally developed for predicting pandemic flu, which does have different characteristics. For example, it is dangerous for children, which COVID-19 is not. So it has been adapted and adjusted from previous models, which is quite normal practice. Mm-hmm. I think the main point of our argument is to say that this is an imperfect piece of mathematical guesswork. It should not be invested with a great deal of confidence. And some people would say, yes, no, we didn't intend it to be used with great confidence. But that is the way, I'm afraid, that the political system has taken it as a very hard and probable prediction.
Matt, politicians all around the world, the one in charge of this pandemic and the one who are responsible of making the decisions very serious and very full of consequences for people, decisions, they have been saying that their decisions are based in science because they are consulting this kind of models and also the experts. How is the proper way to use a model like this? Is this useful to predict the outcome of a pandemic or of an epidemic and then produce a policy regarding these outcomes?
Models are useful. They should be used, but they should be used as thought experiments to envisage what might happen under some circumstances, but they should not be given great confidence and their output should not be treated as evidence. It's important that model results are challenged by other models. The way science works is by one suggestion from one group of scientists being challenged by other suggestions from other groups of scientists. And I hope one of the things that comes out of this episode is that in future the output of one model is challenged by another model, that we have what we call red teams, where we don't get one view and try and pretend that that is the only scientific view. I think the important thing is there are lots of disagreeing voices in science, and we need to hear from all of them, and then it's the politicians who have to decide.
It's very interesting what you are saying because, for example, in the New York Times at the mid-March and the beginning of April, there was an article written by Mark Landler and Stephen Castle, and what they were signaling is that these numbers that the model produced were important not only because of the numbers, but they say it wasn't so much the numbers themselves, frightening dog they were, as who reported them, Imperial College of London. This effect of this big institution and this very traditional scientific institution in some way may worse this kind of errors embedded in the software program.
Yes, I think that is one of the issues here, is that we tend to weigh scientific evidence according to the source, according to which institution it has come from. And the high-profile top universities in the world, and Imperial College is one of the top universities in the world, are expected to produce very high-quality research, and it is relied upon by others. That's why I think it is quite disturbing to find that this model is not a very high-quality piece of prediction software and has its problems, because it has been taken more seriously precisely because it came from Imperial College.
Last question regarding this issue. The Sweden government has also tested the effectiveness of this model to predict their outcomes in Sweden, aren't they?
Yes, Sweden is a good test case for this model because it was used to make specific predictions for Sweden. And Sweden did not impose a compulsory lockdown like most other countries in Europe. And therefore, the outcome in Sweden should have been roughly what the model said, which was several tens of thousands of dead people in Stockholm County alone. In fact, the number of dead is much smaller than that, and only 3,000 dead in the whole country. So that does seem to be a good test that the model was over-predicting deaths as a result of its flaws.
Great, Matt. Let's go on with other kind of issues and topics to discuss. You are a writer, a global thinker, and a biologist, zoologist. Your mind tend to think culture and societies, articulating these cultural environments with the way biology and nature works, depending on the conceptualizations of the frame that the evolutionary biology has done over the years. And one of your clue or your key idea is that evolution of ideas, innovation, is produced based on trade, exchange, swap of one thing for other thing in different from one individual to the other. How could you explain it, please?
Yes, human beings are very unusual among animals because we do a lot of trade, we do a lot of exchange. It's true not just of Western modern societies, but of hunter-gatherer societies too, that they trade, they swap one thing for another, they exchange things. This habit seems to be very ancient and very deeply ingrained in human nature. And it is the reason why we have been able to be an innovative species that has produced new technologies and new concepts as it has become more, as history has gone on. For example, when you cut a society off from trade, it stops innovating. In fact, it sometimes goes backwards. It loses technologies that it already had. A good example is Tasmania, an island off Australia, which was isolated for 10,000 years because of rising sea levels, a very small population there. And they actually lost technologies that they had at the beginning, and they didn't get access to other technologies that were invented after the isolation.
What do you think about the idea that globalization within this context of the pandemic, globalization, which is in some way the epitome of trading, is showing its limits in terms of, for example, China is leading the supplying, the producing and supplying of certain very critical supplies like medical supplies, and this produces a kind of unbalanced trading.
It is true that the world has become very dependent on China, and we are seeing that for medical supplies as well as for other things at the moment. It would be a mistake to abandon all international trade in response to the pandemic, because otherwise, in that case, each country would have to invent its own vaccine. If we do invent a vaccine or a treatment, or indeed a way of keeping people alive during this pandemic, it's important that we are all able to learn from each other. And the great benefit of globalized trade is that we are able to get access to the best practice and the best devices anywhere in the world. So it's very important that we don't abandon global trade as a result of this. But there is one kind of trade that I think we do need to be careful about, and that is trade in ill health, trade in unhealthy diseases or trade in unhealthy practices. And in that respect, the Southeast Asian habit of selling wildlife alive in markets, in so-called wet markets, is clearly a problem, because through globalization, it can affect us in many other continents as well. It is not a local issue, it's a global issue. And so I do think that when it comes to plant diseases and animal diseases and human diseases, we do need to constrain free trade. But in every other way, I think free trade is a good thing. It benefits us to be able to get products from wherever we want in the world. There's no reason, since I don't see why I should be confined to getting products from my own village, and I don't see why I should be confined to getting products from my own country.
You sustain that specialization and generalization, the specialization of producing. I mean, a country decides to specialize in some kind of products because this country is going to swap these products for other products which come from other countries, specialized in building or designing or producing these products. But what globalization has shown is that the specialization is facing this uneven distribution of power, of commercial power.
Well, it is true that successful trading countries do better than others on the whole, but there is a benefit to having imports as well as a benefit to having exports. In fact, a greater benefit, because citizens of Argentina or the UK can get access to cheap and efficiently made goods made in China. All we have to do is give them a piece of paper with money on it. That's quite a good trade when you think about it. And it's been very clear ever since the economist David Ricardo talked about this in 1817 that free trade benefits both countries, the country receiving the goods and the country selling the goods. And there will always be something that China will want to buy from other countries, from Argentina or from the UK. And the more wealthy the Chinese get, the more of a market they provide for tourism and other things that we can provide for them. So it is a mistake to think of trade as a zero-sum game. It is something, there are gains to both sides of trade.
Matt, you are a defender of free market as a side effect of your evolutionary biology way of conceptualizing the world. And today, we see that the states and governments, central governments in different very developed countries, very free market countries like the United States, are having a big role in controlling the pandemic and in helping economy with packages of financial packages to try to sustain the economy relatively open. So is this a challenge? Is this pandemic situation in the way it impacts a free market a challenge to this idea that the less regulated countries, the more free the state countries are much more innovative and are superior in terms of the future that they could face?
I don't think it does teach that lesson, because countries like South Korea, which have very effectively suppressed the virus, have done so by enlisting the efforts of the private sector, of the free market, in developing diagnostic tests and tracking and tracing. And if you think about the things that we are relying on to control the epidemic, we are going to rely on products and drugs and vaccines, many of which will be developed in the private sector. Some will, some won't. And we will also be relying to keep us alive on the private sector, keeping the supply of food going and all these different things. So actually, it is not the case that governments are saving the world and the private sector is not saving the world. Both are working together when they work well. And indeed, the problems we're seeing in many countries are problems of logistics. And if you think about how well many private free market companies cope with logistics, companies like Amazon and other logistics companies, then we do need to call on their evidence. Look also at the question of apps for testing, tracking and tracing. It is Google and Apple that are going to be absolutely crucial to helping us solve that problem.
Matt, you make a very interesting decision between the positive effects, the progressive effects that commercial exchange has compared to the more negative side effects of speculative markets. Could you explain this to us?
Yes, thank you. This is a very important point, I think. It really came out of the credit crunch of 10 years ago, the Great Recession of 2009, when it became clear that despite what went wrong were markets in goods for resale, housing markets, stock markets, debt markets. These were the ones that went wrong. The markets in goods and services for consumption were not a problem. We didn't have toothpaste shortages or insurance shortages or something like that. So the problem is when human beings exchange and trade goods and services that they consume, and that works incredibly well. It's very difficult to not get a good result from free trade in those areas. But when you have a market in an asset which you can then hold, hoping to sell for a higher price in future, like a share or a house, then the markets nearly always produce bubbles in which the price goes up and up and up and then crashes when it comes down again. That's a common feature of markets in assets as opposed to markets in goods and services. And I think this is a very important distinction. On the whole, in the run-up to the financial crisis, we regulated markets in goods and services very heavily, but we regulated markets in assets very lightly. I think that was the wrong way round.
Oh, great. And so the speculative market is much more, we could think that greed is a driver there, which is not a driver in the commercial market.
Well, I mean, people are greedy or not greedy as they are ambitious in both markets. But the structure of a asset market leads to the possibility of a bubble. That is to say that you can make money by the herd effect, by everybody following the herd or the flock, and that just doesn't work if you're selling hamburgers. Say, it's not possible to make a speculative gain in the supply of hamburgers, but it is possible to make a speculative gain in the housing market.
Great. Matt, you have this conceptual frame of based on the Darwinian idea of natural selection and the evolution of nature and of species. You apply it to many fields, many domains, no genes domains, do you say? Which is the role, if it has a role, of diseases, of viruses, of pandemics, and in the evolution of a species like human species?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we are now finding that quite a lot of the genes in our own bodies are from viruses. Many of the junk DNA in our genomes is derived from ancient viruses, but even some very useful genes that we use in our lives are important. There is a gene for a protein called syncytin, which is vital to gestation, to the formation of a placenta. And it turns out that that is a viral gene. It's something that we got from viruses many millions of years ago. So viruses they carry genes around, they enable genes to move between species, they get incorporated into our genomes. Viruses on the whole do us harm, but sometimes they end up being useful as well. It's a very, very interesting area of research.
The idea is we are waiting for the vaccine as the big solution, but maybe it never arrives. In another epidemics, it doesn't exist. AIDS, for example. So, do you think that if we don't get the vaccine, this is a failure for humanity, or it will motivate, inspire another chain of innovations so as to be ready to face this new normality, living along with the coronavirus?
I think it's a very interesting question. I am slightly shocked by how slow vaccine development is. I hadn't realized how long it takes us to develop a vaccine. And that is one of the things we have neglected. We should have done more innovation in vaccine development to be ready. Vaccine development is something.
The average time is 10 years.
Yes, exactly, and it hasn't changed much in 50 years, part of the reason for that is that the pharmaceutical industry does not find vaccines profitable, because they're either very effective and then they do themselves out of business. You don't need them anymore, or they don't work, or they're very specific to one disease. They're very difficult to develop. So we may fail. We may not get a vaccine against this disease. We have many ways of trying now, many new innovative ways of developing vaccines, and one of them may succeed. But we may fail, as indeed we have failed with HIV so far. We do not have a vaccine against the HIV virus, which causes AIDS. But we do have a cure for AIDS. Is that, I think, was what I was saying. We do have a cure for AIDS. We have drugs that can be taken to stop you dying from AIDS. And that's a very important development, because these are antiviral medications. We have developed further antiviral medications for Ebola, which were partially effective. And I have a suspicion that in this case we will develop antiviral therapies to cure this disease rather than vaccines to prevent it. So I think other forms of innovation may solve this problem before a vaccine. And it's possible we may solve the problem with digital technology, with tracking and testing and tracking and tracing and testing. So there are going to be other ways we tackle this problem as well as vaccines.
Well, thank you so much, Matt Ridley, for being here tonight in La Repregunta. It was a pleasure, really.